Our presentations are educational, not political, and held as a service to the community. The views expressed are those of the presenter, not of the league. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website and other media outlets as determined by the league. The recording is the property of the league, and written permission must be sought for the use of the video, which may not be edited or altered. Our speaker tonight is Dr. John Scibak, a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, where he received a PhD in experimental psychology with a specialization in development disabilities and applied behavior analysis. Mr. Scibak worked for many years in healthcare and human services as a research and healthcare administrator. He also held academic positions at Indiana University, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Westfield State University. Despite never having taken a political science course in college, John ran mid-career for elective office and served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 2003 to 2019. While in the legislature, Mr. Scibak co-chaired several legislative committees and wrote the Massachusetts licensing statute for behavior analysts and other key legislative initiatives, including shaken baby syndrome prevention, anti-bullying in schools, insurance coverage for children's hearing aids, and reforms to the Massachusetts state pension system, which saved approximately $6 billion for the taxpayers of Massachusetts. Tonight, John will speak to us about restoring confidence in our electoral system and about voter behavior. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Vilia, and thank you all for attending. I don't know about you, but I think that this 2024 election is going to go down in history. It's an unusual set of circumstances. We have an election that could still be decided by an expression I had never heard before: double haters, who simply have unfavorable views of both candidates. We had an incumbent president who withdrew from the race. We had a challenger, a former president, who winds up surviving an assassination attempt. And so it really is an unusual set of circumstances that we're facing. And I think if we're 100 years from now in the future, people will be talking about this election and everything that happened. So where do we begin? Let's start with those double haters. If I look at them, how many are there? So this slide actually shows you the candidates from the 1988 to the 2024 election. And interestingly, between 1988 and 2012, at least one of the two candidates in each election had a favorable rating of over 50%. But interestingly, for the last 3 years, the last three presidential elections rather, that hasn't been the case. So although this poll was done earlier this year and it showed that double haters represented about 25% of the voters, although in August, New York Times and Siena College poll says it's now down to 8%, so the number of double haters has shrunk. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have favorability ratings that are still below 50%. So the initial question is, will the double haters vote for one of them? Or are they going to cast a protest vote? And so what do we mean by protest votes? And are they a modern phenomenon? If you look, there are really 5 different types of protest votes. You can abstain, you can fill out a blank or leave a blank, or a spoiled ballot, a write-in vote, none of the above, or a third-party candidate. Interestingly, protest votes actually go back to French Revolutionary times, and specifically the legislative election in France in 1881. Now, in the United States, abstention, just simply not voting, is probably the most common type of protest vote that we have. And it's fascinating. I found a map developed by a cartographer who, in essence, looked at every county in the United States in the 2016 election. And he counted the number of blank votes as well as the number of votes for Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump. If Trump received a majority in that county, the county is colored red. If it was blue, then that means Hillary Clinton got the majority. But what's interesting is the number of black counties, the counties where the winner was actually none of the above. And so what had happened, the winner of that election would have been nobody. I think Hillary, and, and, and I can't see the actual numbers right now. I apologize. I think one of the two got 42 electoral votes. The other one maybe got 70 or 60. But nobody got over 400 electoral votes. And so it's a fascinating situation. I talked about 1881 in France, and in that election, 3% of the national vote just simply did not vote, or they spoiled their ballot. And we'll talk about that. Some areas had as many as 20% of the votes were just not counted. Now, the fascinating thing about Europe is countries like the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, and France actually count blank votes and include them in their turnout numbers. They're symbolic. They don't affect the overall results, but the people know what percentage of the voters did not vote in a particular election. It's also pretty common in South America. In fact, in Argentina in 1957, Juan Perón was in exile, but he got voters in Argentina to cast 2.1 million blank ballots. And so blank ballots received 10,000 more votes than the first party that was listed on the ballot. And so it's interesting to look at, obviously, this one phenomenon. And as I said, in France, what happens is they still use paper ballots. They don't have machines. The votes are cast in person. And so what is happening is we're still looking at numbers and growing numbers of blank votes. You can look up the numbers from both races between Macron and Le Pen to see, and somewhere around 4 to 5% of the people just left the ballot blank. But for some people, that's not enough. That is insufficient. So what they will do is they'll spoil the ballot. And a spoiled ballot is when somebody either votes for too many people or makes additional marks or comments instead of casting a vote. Spoiled votes are pretty common in the UK and Australia. Here's an example from the UK where the person said, "I can't believe this is the best the UK has to offer, so I am spoiling my vote." I have to tell you, it was difficult for me to find a ballot because many of them were filled with either obscene images or obscene language. But it's very clear that in those countries, people really are concerned and have no hesitation or trepidation about spoiling their ballot. Now, as one might expect, spoiled ballots and blank votes are more common in countries where voting is mandatory or compulsory. So this graph shows, on the left are countries with non-compulsory voting, and the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance basically analyzed 1,439 elections and showed that it's between 1% and 2%. On the other hand, in countries with compulsory voting, it was between 3 and almost 5%. And the other interesting thing is that the number of blanks and spoiled votes have increased over time. They're more prevalent today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Now, why do people do that? Well, in countries in particular, in the compulsory voting countries, these people are likely to show up to vote and will cast a blank or a spoiled ballot rather than abstain so that they can avoid a fine or some other sanction. In 2012, I was at Epcot one day and ran into a couple from Brazil. They had missed their primary election and were told that in order to vote in the general election, they would have to appear before a panel to explain why they didn't vote in the primary. And they could be fined. And in some countries, fines are a few cents. But in a couple of countries, they're as high as €1,000. So people, rather than paying that fine, will simply go in and leave the ballot blank or fill it in with some crazy statement like we saw in another ballot. So this attracted my curiosity, and I looked in Massachusetts. So I analyzed some data over a 16-year period, and what we're seeing are election results for the state legislature. So from 2000 to 2014, voter turnout ranged from about 50% to 78%. The number of or percentage of blank ballots was somewhere between about 13% and 21%. So a number of people showed up and left the ballot blank. What I found interesting was in the green at the bottom were the number of races that were potentially decided by blank votes. And what I mean is that the number of blank ballots was larger than the margin of victory for a particular candidate. And so in all but two, so in 7 of the 9 there was a race which was decided potentially by blank votes. Now that's Massachusetts. In the 2016 election here in Florida, 161,000 Florida residents who voted in the general election did not cast a valid vote for president. That 161,000 is almost 50,000 votes more than Trump's margin of victory. Trump won by about 111 or 112,000 votes. So it's interesting that the protest vote that you make can have an impact in terms of what's happening and potentially on the outcome of an election. I had a colleague in the legislature who sat 2 seats from me, and he lost his election by 1 vote. There was an election in Virginia a number of years ago where it was a flat-footed tie. They did a recount. They did a second recount. It was a tie, and they're trying to decide who would win. And the solution was, according to their state law, they flipped a coin. So someone lost an election on the basis of a coin flip. So the next form of protest, obviously, are write-ins. So I'm taking 6 write-ins from New Jersey. And the interesting thing about write-ins is how states regard them. And it varies from state to state. So many states require that a write-in candidate has to file paperwork before the election. Otherwise, the state will not count write-in votes. So on this ballot, I assume that John McCain, Chris Christie, and Bernie Sanders filled in the paperwork. I'm not so sure about Kanye West. I'm not sure how they would get the paperwork to God or none of the above. So write-ins can make a difference. In fact, I won my first election in the Massachusetts legislature as a write-in candidate. But let's look at none of the above. And this year was a unique year for that particular phenomenon. So there are 17 countries that have none of the above or some version on their ballot. It could be none of the above. It could be I don't support anyone. It could be blank vote, blank, empty ballot. Of those 17 countries, 5 of them, Argentina, Belgium, Greece, Peru, and Uruguay, have mandatory voting. So one would expect and not be surprised that none of the above is on the ballot. But when you start looking, there are some other examples that are interesting. So Sheldon Bergson, in 2016, Sheldon Bergson's from Ontario, and he legally changed his name to Z, none of the above. He put the Z in front of none of the above to make sure that he was the last candidate on the ballot. And thought this way here, if he didn't do that and he was in the middle of the ballot, people below him might get votes. The unfortunate thing with Sheldon is that he did not understand or study the process. And so in Ontario, where he was running, they put your family name first. So on the ballot, he was listed as above Z none of the. So he wanted to be last and he wasn't. The irony is that Sheldon ran as none of the above, I think 3 times. He first ran in 2013, I believe, or maybe even earlier than that, as Sheldon Bergson. And he got more votes as Sheldon Bergson than as none of the above. So Sheldon was actually a more viable candidate than he even knew he was and could have been. But before we go to Nevada, let's look at another country. In Russia had against all on their ballots from about 1988 to 2006, around the time of perestroika. Prior to that, if you look at a Russian election, the candidate, 99% of the people would vote, and 99.5% of the people would vote for the winner. And things were so bad that actually the newspapers printed the story of the winner like the day or 2 before the election because they already knew what was going to happen. But as part of some of their reforms, they introduced secret ballots and they allowed against all on the ballot. In 2003, it was an interesting experience. There were a number of individuals who were running, and against all was an option. In the 2003 election, against all scored higher than 19 of the 23 or 24 political parties in Russia. There were 4 candidates who, as soon as they were declared the winner, as soon as against all was declared the winner, those 4 cities or counties wound up having a schedule a second election about 3 months later. They with brand new candidates. No one who was on the ballot for against all could run in the second election. 3 of the 4 elected somebody, but this one city, I think it's Ulyanovsk, again voted against all. And so what ultimately happened is that was the deciding election. And that city was not represented in the Duma, which is the equivalent of the Congress. The people in that city actually felt it was better to have no one represent them than have the candidates who were on the ballot. And it's really kind of unique. So we get to Nevada. Nevada is the only state in the United States where none of these candidates appears for all statewide races and federal ballots. It went into effect shortly after Watergate. There have been 5 primaries where none of the candidates received the most votes, including this one in 2024, where Nikki Haley received 30.6% of the vote, and none of these candidates received 63.3%. Now, there has to be an asterisk here. Nevada also this year did something very unusual. They had both a presidential primary and a caucus. Donald Trump said that he did not want anyone to vote. He did not feel that the primary was the legitimate way to elect the delegates and to decide who would go to the convention. So he encouraged people to solely vote in the primary. So Nikki Haley was essentially the only candidate on the ballot with none of these candidates. And obviously she lost. None of the candidates, as I said, ever got more than 5% in any general election. And the situation in Nevada is that none of these candidates could never win. Whoever is the highest scoring candidate would win the election, assuming that a majority did win. But interestingly, there are 24 states in the District of Columbia besides Nevada that have some sort of a version of this, allowing people to vote uncommitted, no preference, non-committed delegate. Minnesota, Michigan, a lot of those states, several of those states received attention this spring. Although none of the above and uncommitted votes typically get about 7% of the vote in an election, in this year, it was slightly different. So we start with the Iowa, in yellow, the Iowa Democratic Caucus. 3.9% of the people said they were uncommitted. Then we look at Michigan, 13.3%, and that got a lot of play, saying, boy, that's pretty high. It's almost double the average 7%. What people didn't realize is when Barack Obama was running for his second term, 11% of the voters in Michigan voted uncommitted. So the Biden response was only slightly higher. And there you see Nevada with the 63.3%. You also see that there are, other states like Florida. Florida does not have none of the above or uncommitted as an option. The primary in Florida, the Republican primary, there was no Democratic primary. The Republican primary in Florida occurred after Haley had dropped out or suspended her campaign, and DeSantis had suspended his campaign. So you had 2 candidates on the ballot who suspended their campaigns, said essentially they weren't running. Haley got 13.9%, DeSantis got 3.7%, and Trump got 81%. So despite the fact that he was really the only viable candidate on the ballot, there were still essentially 19% of the people who decided to vote in some other fashion. So the question is, we're talking primaries generally, does none of the above make a difference? Does it really have an impact? So we're going to look at, and I apologize, it's a little complicated, but it's really easy. This is data from Nevada from 1976 to 2016. So it's 40 years of data. In the blue, you see the residual vote. And residual vote are either blank ballots or ballots where somebody voted for 2 people or they spoiled their ballot in some fashion. The black line at the top is essentially the sum of these two. So when you add the residual votes and the none of the above votes in 1976, a little over 2%, it comes to slightly under 5%. The fascinating thing about this data is that with the introduction of none of the above, which started in 1976, the percentage of blank and spoiled ballots, the residual votes, has essentially continued to drop and continued to drop until in 2016. In 2016, it was down to 0. This is showing the number of none votes, and the reason the two are together is because it was 0 for residual votes. So it's interesting that giving people a choice, even if that choice is none of the above, people will take that choice and are less likely to leave their ballot blank or spoil it. They see that as a viable option. Now, what about third-party candidates? We just lost one last week. So these are the most popular, most successful third-party candidates in the last 150 years. Lee Drudman came up with this, and his criteria were to be considered successful, you had to have either gotten at least 10% of the vote share or won at least one state. And so when you look at Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, he got 27.5% of the vote and carried 6 states. So he finished second in that election. He beat one of the major party candidates. But George Wallace in 1968 was the last third party candidate to win an electoral vote. So Ross Perot ran a couple of times. We've got the Libertarian Party, we've got the Green Party. Those parties have not succeeded in breaking through and capturing at least one electoral vote. But despite the lack of success by third party candidates, they've impacted a number of elections. You know, everybody knows about Ralph Nader in 2000. We talk about Florida. In the 2000 election, we look at blanks and Ralph Nader's vote. If Ralph Nader wasn't a candidate, he could have won New Hampshire. I mean, Al Gore could have won New Hampshire, and that could have been sufficient as well. So what do we see? In 2020, this to me is fascinating. So let's look at 4 of the 7 swing states today: Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. We're going to focus on the top. We're going to focus on Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona. The difference between Biden and Trump was 10,000 votes. Jorgensen ran on the Libertarian ticket at 51,000 votes. If he didn't run as a Libertarian, chances are, based on what we know about political leanings, those Libertarian votes probably would have gone to Donald Trump. Same way in Georgia, 62,000 votes for the Libertarian. The difference was 11,000. If Trump only got half of Jorgensen's votes in those 2 states, he would have won them and had an additional 27 electoral votes. Pennsylvania is a bit tougher. Obviously, Jorgensen doesn't do that. But Wisconsin, if he got 40% of Jorgensen's votes, if Jorgensen wasn't in the race, he would have won Wisconsin. Those 37 electoral votes would have been added to Trump's total, and there would have been a tie of 269 electoral votes, which meant the vote and the determination of who wins the presidential election would have gone to the House, with each state having 1 vote. And Trump would have won the 2020 election because Republicans controlled more delegations in more states. So when you think about not going to vote or voting blanks, you have to think about the potential implications that can have for you. Now, on Friday, Robert Kennedy Jr. drops out, supports Trump. So what's the impact of Kennedy going to be? He's on the ballot in 3 of the 7 swing states. He's on the ballot in Michigan. All the states in blue, Kennedy's on the ballot. In red, he's not on the ballot. The gray states, he didn't get enough signatures, and the pale blue ones, he's got signatures, but they're still waiting to finally get approved. So he's on the ballot in Michigan. He's on the ballot in Nevada. He's on the ballot in North Carolina. And he has the signatures and waiting for confirmation in Georgia and in Wisconsin. But he will not be on the ballot in Pennsylvania. So the question is, do his supporters in those states or other states, and in other states, I think people will vote for Kennedy if they think their state's not a swing state. My vote's not going to mean much, so I was originally supporting him, and I'm for him. So I can see him getting votes in California. I can see him getting votes in Louisiana. I can see him getting votes in Indiana. But what about those swing states? Do his supporters vote for Kennedy or for Trump? Since 61% of his supporters have an unfavorable opinion, have an unfavorable opinion of both Kamala Harris, well, all 3, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, according to the Pew Research Center. So if they have an unfavorable opinion toward both Harris and Trump, will they stay home and not vote? And it's still too early. He dropped out on Friday, and generally takes about a week or so for polls to start to emerge that have some meaning. So we'll have to see what happens in the next week or so, what the impact of Kennedy dropping out and endorsing Trump could be on the ballot. So when we look at our population, like the general population, voters are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. So this reflects the white population, the Hispanics, the blacks, Asians, and others. So we see it in terms of others. The total, it clearly has changed from 1996 to 2023. But the changes have been much larger for the Democratic Party than for the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is more consistently white, fewer minorities, as opposed to the Democrats. And that's one of the concerns and one of the issues. One of the concerns for Trump saying there are more Hispanics who lean Democratic. Are they going to vote for Kamala Harris if they weren't going to vote for Joe Biden? Or what's going to ultimately happen? And again, we're going to have to see what these polls look like over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to talk about polling near the end and some of the shortcomings with polls, by the way. Now, what we do know is that more Americans consider themselves independent. So from we look back to 1988, the majority of people consider themselves Democrats, somewhere about 36 or 37%, 32% Republican. Now they're both essentially tied at 27%. And 43% of the population consider themselves independent. But if you're an independent, where do you go? What do you do? Do you vote in primaries? Particularly in states like Florida that are closed primaries, do you have an opportunity? Do you switch? What does the data show? The data shows that the majority of people, by a slight margin, lean Republican of the independents, 45%, 43% lean Democratic. So we're looking at roughly 88 or 89%. So about 10% of independents are true independents. And the real kicker for this election is going to be, what will they do? And we've seen states in the past couple of elections that are so close that it's possible that you will see no one staying home. Or it's possible you're going to say, I'll go. And one or two of those swing states could actually swing the election. But despite these changing demographics, voting tendencies are fairly stable. So we're going to look at the top. We're going to look at the top graph first. Well, let's look at the bottom first. So what we're going to see in the bottom graph, we're going to look at the swing states. If I look at 2016 and compare it to 2020, some states flipped. Arizona was red for Trump in 2016 and blue for Biden in 2020. Georgia was blue for Biden in 2020, was red in 2016. Wisconsin was red in 2016, blue in 2020. Michigan was blue in 2020, red in 2016. And Pennsylvania, blue in 2020 and red in 2016. But the important graph is the one on the top. It's showing the Electoral College voting record since 1996. The dark brown colors in the center of the country show that for the last 6 elections, those voters have always voted Republican. We look at the dark blue, Washington, Oregon, California, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. They have always voted blue. So the West Coast and New England, New York consistently votes Democratic. The Heartland and much of the South consistently votes Republican. Florida is 4 out of 6. So the interesting thing here is where are we going to go? What is ultimately going to happen here? And that's in part why the pundits keep talking about those 7 swing states. They are the ones who are running the show. But let's look at 2020. Look at the next slide. We've got the 7 swing states. In 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 7 swing states, there were more votes cast for other candidates besides Biden and Trump than the margin of victory was for those in that election in those states. So a big question here is, where are these people? These people are voting for, these would be the RFK Jr. votes, the Jill Stein votes, the Libertarian votes. What are they going to do in 2020? Will they do anything different? Will they pick one of the 2 major candidates or stay with where they are? And this to me is fascinating. These are 2024 swing state voters. So they interviewed Democrats, Republicans, and independents from those 7 swing states. The first question, that was, did you vote in the 2020 election? 26% said no. 23% said no from the Republicans and Democrats. So essentially over 70%, 75 to 77% of Democrats and Republicans voted in the 2020 election. But 53% of the independent voters in the swing states did not vote in the 2020 election. And the second question, does your vote make a difference in the outcome? 63% of the Republicans say yes. 70% of the Democrats say yes. Only 31% of the independents say yes. So if they didn't vote in 2020 and only 31% believe their vote's going to make a difference, will they stay home? Will it make a difference? Where are they ultimately going to go? Which brings us to the next piece, like who are our voters? Who is most likely to vote and least likely to vote in the 2024 election? If you look by age, and it's consistent, it's been consistent since 1984. The group that votes has the lowest turnout are 18 to 29-year-olds. Slightly more for 30 to 34-year-olds, slightly more for 45 to 59, and 60 and over are the champions. That's an interesting slide. People over 60 are more likely to vote. People under 30 are least likely to vote. Now, one of the polls says that 77% of young people say that they plan on definitely voting in the upcoming November election. 77% of young people, but 90% of older citizens, my peer group, said they're going to vote. The question that has to be asked is what will happen to those young people? Will they follow through? They say they're going to vote, but if I look at it, of people 75 and older, let's look at 65 or 55 and over, 74, 78, 76%. These are people who are registered voters. So 3/4 of the population above the age of 55 are registered voters. If I look at the 18 to 24-year-olds, less than 50%, only 49% of those people are currently registered voters. It picks up when you get to 25 to, should be 25 to 34. There's a typo on the graph. It goes up to 62%. And a large reason for that is these people are now raising families. They're now more concerned about school board races and education funding and things. So all of a sudden they're settling down. They're finding a community to live in. But if I look at only 50%, less than 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds have even registered to vote, the 77% turnout rate is virtually impossible. It just doesn't make sense. You need to look at that population and try to get them out. So we're starting to look at the numbers, and we also look at polls. So what do polls do? What do polls say? Are they accurate? Do they influence turnout? On average, this is from the American Association for Public Opinion Research. They are the premier, well-respected group. They said on average, national presidential polls had their worst performance in 40 years. And state-level presidential polls had their worst performance in 20 years in the 2020 election. Part of their problem was 22 million more votes were cast in 2020 than 2016. And these new voters, they didn't expect them. And so those new voters could have affected the accuracy of pre-election polls. Among the polls in the final 2 weeks, the average error in either direction was 4.5 points for national polls and 5.1 for state-level presidential polls. So we know that the polls weren't necessarily accurate in 2020, but what's going to happen now? Where are we going? What are our alternatives? The problem that we have with polls, a couple of things. Number one is turnout is generally lower than self-reports in pre-election polls. So there's a lot of data showing, professionals, academicians have looked at this, and people say they're going to vote, but they don't always follow through on what they say. And some of it's, I found one study and said, yes, turnout was lower by, I think, 3.5 or 4 points for women who had a child within the 2 months prior to the election. So yes, all of a sudden you have these other responsibilities. So turnout's generally lower. The other thing we're seeing is decreasing response rate by voters. So it's a sampling issue. I can't tell you how many texts I get and how many phone calls I get that I don't answer, and they're really polling questions. And I'm suspicious. Because I don't know who's asking me. I don't know where that data is going to go. I'm worried about the data mining is going to happen. So voters are less likely to be responding to to pollsters. In some cases, voters are going to give incorrect responses to affect the poll results. I'm going to screw this whole thing up. So I'm 100% for candidate A, but I'm going to tell them I'm 100% for candidate B. More importantly, with the undecided is the timing of the poll and trying to determine what they're going to do. If you ask an undecided voter today what they're going to do 2 months from now, they may not be sure. So the accuracy of it depends on when you poll them. And finally, presidents aren't elected by the popular vote, but by the electoral vote. And polls really nobody really analyzes and focuses on what the impact and the connect between the popular vote and the electoral vote. You would need a pollster who is polling nationally multiple times and try to determine what the turnout's going to be, what they think will happen in a certain state, and then project what the electoral votes will be for that state. And I think it's virtually impossible, unreliable, and that's why nobody ever does it. So, should we abolish the Electoral College? By about a 2-to-1 margin, this is from the Pew Research Center. Americans want the popular vote, not the Electoral College, to determine and decide who's president. The only problem with this poll is abolishing the Electoral College is unlikely because it's going to require a constitutional amendment. But there are alternatives that have been proposed, which would keep the Electoral College in place, but make other changes that make it more meaningful. The first one is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So what it is, states essentially decide on how their electors are chosen. There's the Electoral College is mentioned in the Constitution, but there's no mention of how electors are chosen. That's left to the states. And that was an important issue with the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was leaving the authority to the states. So when states holding a majority of electoral votes enact this compact, say we're going to work together, then it goes into effect. It's already been enacted by 17 states with 205 electoral votes. These include small states like Delaware, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and the District of Columbia, medium states like Colorado, Connecticut, Oregon, Washington, and big states like California, Illinois, and New York. If it passes in one chamber, it's already passed one chamber in 8 additional states. If it passes the second chamber, they get 78 more electoral votes, which puts them at 283, which is over the 270. So it could, in fact, happen. What's interesting, and I had a discussion with someone earlier today, is what happens if some states do this and other states do not? If they do this, a state that passes it will say, okay, whoever wins the popular vote nationally gets all of our electors. But a state that says, no, we're not going to do that, will continue to, and some states may choose to do that in hopes of making their state a swing state or a key battleground state. So a state like Florida says, no, we don't want to do that. There are 30 electoral votes. We'll give the electoral votes to the candidate who receives the most votes in our state. Second option are top 2 primaries. They're already in effect in California and Louisiana. And what happens is they've gotten rid of the partisan primary. So in California, anybody who wants to run for a particular seat, you want to run for the state legislature, and it's unclear whether these can happen for president. It's varied depending on what the states are doing. So you could have 5 candidates, you could have 50 candidates, and the top 2 go to the general election. Louisiana's done it similarly, but a little bit differently. Louisiana, if one of the candidates, you could have 50 candidates, you could have 5 candidates. If one of those candidates gets 50% of the vote, the election's over. There's no general election. He or she has already won. We've now got top 4 primaries with ranked choice voting in the general election. So in Alaska started this election ago. They are going to vote in November to possibly get rid of this, specifically the ranked choice voting. So 10 people can run in the primary. The top 4 go into the general election. And the general election is ranked choice voting, as we see in states like Colorado, Maine, and the like. Nevada is there as a top 5 they passed it once and they had to pass it a second time, and that's this coming fall. So they would go top 5 with ranked choice voting in the general election. So these last 2 options really are not in place yet, but could be. So does it make any difference? If I look at the top 2 primaries, and this is pretty simple. In 2008, you're looking at the rate of uncontested primary elections. Nobody fills in the ballot. They're leaving it blank. The person's running by themselves. Nobody's running against them. They've essentially won. In 2008, that was about 76, 77% of all primary elections were uncontested. Nobody was running other than one candidate. 2012, they do the top 2 and do this implementation, and it goes down from 78% to about 16%. Went up a little bit more and down. So the point is that the top 2 voting has dramatically reduced uncontested primaries in California from 75% somewhere between 20 and 30%. Now, let's look at primary. You know, we're talking about these strategies which will eliminate primaries. So how many people vote in primaries? Closed primary, like Florida's closed primary, you get somewhere between 18%. Partially closed primary, it's about the same. If you open it to unaffiliated or independents, you may get closer to 20%. Partially open, back down to about 16%. An open primary is the first one where people can vote in the primary regardless of their party affiliation, and we're now about 22%, 21%. The top 2, California and Louisiana, we're about 28%. Top 4 in Alaska, we're about 37 or 38%. So the data show that top 2 and top 5 primaries increase voter turnout considerably. And that's kind of important. When you think about it, if you're getting 20% of the registered voters for a particular party, for both parties, voting in the primary, then 20% of that party is determining who's going to be on the ballot in November. So it's no wonder that some people decide to stay home and not vote. Now, there's a problem with the ranked choice voting in the general election, that the second part of this, which you don't necessarily have to have. And the reason is that there are 10 states, including Florida, that have currently banned ranked choice voting. So while it exists in Maine, Hawaii, and Alaska, and it's used in some elections in these blue states, these orange states prohibit it. So you could never use the ranked choice voting in the in Florida as it is, but there's no requirement. You could do top 4, top 2, top 5, and then just have them go right from what would have been the primary to the general election, and do it the way we do other elections. So I'm looking at the time, and so I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from Henry Kissinger, who says, "Does anyone have any questions for my answers?" Thank you.
Let's see, I'm looking in the chat. Whoops. I'm looking in the chat to see if we have any questions, and we do not yet. Please, if you do have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat. In the meantime, John, as you know, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because I was already asking you about this. As we see how important non-party affiliated voters are, even I think that it's a little bit lower in Florida just because people know they have to be a certain party if they want to vote, but it's not necessarily indicative of their point of view. The league is always trying to communicate with voters, and we're just trying to talk about how do we reach out to NPAs? How do we talk to independents and non-party affiliated voters? You know, whether we're saying that their vote is important, which apparently they think it's not, or just getting them to turn out to vote. Do you have any suggestions on that?
I think one of the things we need to look at is, let's look at last week's election. So you had a large number of Democrats who wound up switching, which many of them typically would not do, but switched because of the importance, as they saw it, of the hospital board vote. The school vote was nonpartisan. School votes could become partisan based on one of the proposals that is on the ballot. And so I think it's important to recognize that the decision you make is not irreversible. And I think it's, there's the old adage that, if you don't vote, then you don't have a right to complain. And I think some of these strategies, whether it's looking at eliminating party primaries and opening it up to top 2, top 4, top 5, would give people more choices. Now, I expect that both the Democratic and Republican parties will fight that, just as the presidential debates were under the auspices of the League of Women Voters, and they've gone from the League of Women Voters, and now essentially the parties and are running the show, and putting in certain rules, like you must have a percentage in a ballot poll, you must have a certain amount of money raised. So there are constraints that, in large part, are ensuring that we remain with a two-party system. We've had a two-party system here since 1854. And the question is, does the two-party system of 1854 fit 2024? I also think it's important for people to start to think about the implications. I think one thing that will help is these number of close races. And I think getting the word out in terms of the impact of blank ballots or spoiled ballots. They used to, people thought voting for a third-party candidate was a wasted vote. Not voting or leaving a blank ballot is a wasted vote. And we can find elections all around the country where the outcome would be different if those people had voted.
Well, we had a great example of that, the impact of closed primaries here in Sarasota County, when one of the districts, the outcome would have likely been different if it had been an open primary. So interesting. Okay, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. Sure. Jeffrey is asking you to explain ranked choice voting.
I'm sorry, explain.
Ranked choice voting.
Okay. So ranked choice voting, thanks for the question. So you will see, let's assume it's a top 4 state. So you go to the polls in November, and you're now going to see 4 names. And you're going to choose your first choice, and that may be your only choice. You could choose first, second, third, and fourth. If your fourth choice, if you choose 4, and your fourth choice doesn't make the cut, then that vote gets reallocated. And so in essence, you get an opportunity to vote multiple times and express your preferences. There's been some objection to it, looking at fringe candidates, that if Vilya, Elena, and myself are voting for a candidate, and there are 3 candidates running, and I vote for candidate 1, and Elena votes for candidate 2, and Vilya votes for candidate 3, we're fine, and we'll see how it all turns out with the other voters. But potentially, it's like, who's the one I don't want? And so what sometimes happens is people will vote for a less preferred candidate to prevent another candidate from from winning. There's also a phenomenon that's not talked about a great deal called bullet voting. So if you have, let's say you had 3 seats open for the school committee, and there are 4 candidates running, you prefer one of them, so you vote for that one person and do not cast the other 2 votes. So you're not giving votes to your less preferred alternatives.
Well, I think, I think the bottom line is you still get to vote. Everybody can vote. You can vote for 1 candidate, 3 candidates, 5 candidates, but you have just a lot more choice, and you have a stronger voice. That's right. In the outcome.
If your first choice is the lowest scoring candidate, then they go to your second choice, and that goes to the candidate, and that's how it continues on. So
you can vote your true preferences and know that your vote is going to count. I also put into the chat the website for the organization that is working for ranked choice voting in Florida, even though there is a prohibition on it right now, which was actually originated because Sarasota voters passed ranked choice voting for municipal elections in 2007. So it's got a very interesting history connected to Sarasota. But you could visit that website to learn more about ranked choice voting. Okay, Barbara
there also was a bill filed. A bill was filed in the Florida legislature this year to look at top 4 voting. It didn't make any progress, but at least it's been filed, and we'll see what ultimately happens down the road.
Okay. And Barbara is asking, what is a partially open or partially closed primary?
That's a great question. And it varies from state to state. In some cases, you don't have to be a registered member of a party. Massachusetts, for example, I could be an independent and I can walk into the polling place and they say, would you like a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot? And so at that point, it's partially open because I can go in as an independent. I choose a ballot and I vote for whichever ballot I chose. And then once that ballot is in the machine, I can fill out another form that unenrolls me again, makes me an independent voter again. So in some cases, that's a possibility. Other cases, there are deadlines. Other states, there are firm deadlines in terms of when you have to be a registered member of the party. And so those really are closed. So they give you options to change your party affiliation. And in many states, if you were a member of a small party, whether it's the Libertarians, Green Party, the Free Marijuana Party, there are a whole series of them. In some states, like my home state of Massachusetts, you don't get to vote in any primary because unless your party has a primary, so you can't switch over. You would have to unenroll and essentially decertify yourself as a member of that party. But then as soon as you cast the vote, you can go right back to that original party.
Mm-hmm. And I will point out that the League of Women Voters of Florida and US both do have a position in support of open primaries. So, okay, any other questions? We don't have anything else in the chat. I will ask one more question about the young adult voters, because obviously they're registering at lower levels, they're voting at lower levels. Any words of wisdom about how to entice them into the arena?
I think what's happened with the last two, both the Republican and Democratic convention, is that both conventions open themselves to influencers. Influencers being people who have a strong following on social media. And so they encouraged and invited people to come to participate as regular members of media. Some of these people have thousands and thousands of followers. So I think that's one option. Another name that's been tossed out by both parties is Taylor Swift. We saw Taylor Swift with an endorsement 4 years ago. We now see Trump and Harris both talking. There's a person who carries some influence with a large number of young people. I think the important thing is when you get someone registered to vote, it's to try to get them to make a plan and a commitment. So there's data showing that if you make a plan, and it's difficult sometimes for young families and for couples. It's like, well, I can't tell you when I'm going to vote because I have to talk to my spouse or see what the school schedule is. But making a plan actually increases the likelihood of someone voting. They've thought it through. They've committed, I'm going to be there. Many of these young people who don't come, it's just distractions. School has started. Are they have classes at that time? Are they going away to college? Did they forget to request an absentee ballot in time? Are they out of state? Well, which state do I register in? And a whole series of things. So I think much of it is educational. I am encouraged that we're seeing some numbers start to go up. And I think we just need to continue to work on it.
Yeah, actually, I just saw today an article. I haven't finished reading it, but I just saw an article that last month, registration of young Black women tripled. So I need to go back and look at that data because that's pretty astounding, but as a result of what happened in the election. But I thought that was pretty incredible. We do have a couple of other questions that came up.
Sure.
One, Elena is asking, does the registration process have an impact on general election voting? For example, if we had same-day voter registration, would that impact voter turnout?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. And it can work both ways. So there are some individuals who would say, yes, if I know that I can vote today and I can go and register, or there's automatic voting registration when I get my driver's license or whatever, then I'm a registered voter and there's no obstacle for me on election day. On the other hand, there are individuals who are saying, wait a minute, what prevents an individual from, erroneously or illegally registering and voting that day and casting a ballot? I remember a number of years ago, probably 2012 or 2016, there was a New York Post article looking at the number of individuals who voted in both New York and Florida, snowbirds who voted in both places. So I think the format and the style makes sense. I got to say, I've worked the polls here in Sarasota for the last 4 elections. I think the way that the elections are run is impeccable. I've been a deputy. I've watched the numbers. The people who were taking mail-in ballots, checking signatures. Is it signed? The notion of a privacy sleeve, which I've not seen in other states, so that some person looks to see, is this signed, and does this signature match the signature when the person registered to vote? That person then opens the envelope. It's still in the privacy seal. It gets moved on to someone else who has no idea who that person is, but now takes the ballot out and ultimately goes in the machine. So I think it's a system that works, seems to work well. And I think in large part that's due to what happened in 2000. And so Florida has been working to improve consistently in the last 24 years.
Okay. And Brenda is asking, how much does early voting and mail-in voting increase the overall percentage of the vote? So I guess that question is, having those alternatives to the primary election day, what impact does that have?
I think it has a large impact, particularly here. One of the things that I like about Florida is for early voting, you don't have to go to your home precinct. You can go anywhere. So I worked early voting at the Gulfgate Library, and there were people who had no intention of voting. They came in, saw the early voting was happening. They went and got their book or returned their book and then decided to vote. So I think it increases the likelihood. The thunderstorm that we received today, if this were election day and people hadn't done early voting, I'm sure a significant number of people would have said, well, it's not going to make any difference. I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to go out and get soaking wet. So I think that does make a difference. It's interesting to, I understand both sides with questions about voter and ballot integrity. But it's a fact that the voting style has changed, that we're seeing much more early voting. We're seeing much more mail-in voting. In 2020, Donald Trump was opposed to it. In 2024, looking at the numbers that he's seeing, he's now embracing the notion of early voting and mail-in voting because it's having an impact. I think it's a matter of making things as easy as possible while protecting the integrity of the voting process.
Excellent. Well, you know what? You have timed it perfectly. We're at 8 o'clock, and that was a very exciting presentation to me because I'm kind of an election nerd, but thank you so much for sharing your insights and your hard work with us. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to remind the audience, first of all, thank you for attending tonight. I'd like to remind you that the opinions expressed are those of the presenter, not the league, and that this recording will be posted on our website if you'd like to review it again or share it with friends and neighbors. So thank you again, John, for being with us, and thank you to the audience for joining the League of Women Voters.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I know that you also said, this is Elena. I could put my video back on.
I can see it.
because we're the only two on anymore, but you did say that you would be willing to share your
Sure.
slides if anybody wanted to do that. I think what we'll do is maybe say that to let everybody know that we have them, and if somebody wants them, we'll send them maybe a copy of the PDF
Yeah.
version of
The
that.
PDF is so much smaller, obviously, and easier.
Well, and there's a little protection with that too,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
terms of that somebody can't lift your information out. So I think that's what we'll do. Just like say that it is available if anybody would like to have it. So
Great.
okay. All right. Well,
Thanks.
thank you again so much. This is
It
great.
was a lot of fun. This was good. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Well, good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.